Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of June 22nd. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm very happy to be joined today by my friend Ross Ramsey, who is Executive Editor and one of the founders of the Texas Tribune. Not to make him sound, overly old, which he is not. Ross is a longtime observer of Texas politics, has been on this podcast and many other productions of the Texas Politics Project. He's been very generous with us over the years. And he writes a column 3 times a week for the Texas Tribune, which is and his column is really the core of the analysis content, I think, that the Tribune puts out. Not that there's not a lot of other analytical content in there, but Ross is kind of the front line of what we, I guess, used to call the op-ed function at the Tribune. So thank you for being here, Ross.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
I want to start, since we've talked about your writing. As we record this, Texas is undeniably a hotspot of the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. And for that matter, Central Texas, where we are right now, is one of the hotter spots within that hotspot. And your column is a good starting point for a discussion of what's going on in the politics that fall out of that. This column, which was published in the Tribune on Monday morning, talked about the politics of masking and the policy around that and how that's shaping the debate. So I'm wondering what the burr under the saddle for that column was, Ross. What, you can write about basically anything you want. I'm wondering what moved you to write that and what you had to say.
We seem to be at an intersection of people demanding action in response to the coronavirus, new action in response to the coronavirus, sort of a rising level of protest about reopening everything too early. And also from, the people who wanted everything to reopen, a reluctance to do any of the things that make reopening possible, or to do some of them. And the leading example of that is masks. The governor has gone through this list of 4 things over and over. If you are at risk, you probably should stay in. If you go out, you should socially distance, you should wash your hands, and you should wear a mask. And he can't even get the lieutenant governor to wear a mask. And there's been this press from, civil libertarians, primarily on the conservative end of the pool, from some legislators, definitely on the conservative end of the pool, saying that, the government shouldn't order me to wear a mask. I should be able to do whatever I want. A friend of mine who's even older than I am pointed out that a lot of these arguments are the same arguments that met with the initial efforts to require seatbelts in cars. How dare you tell me what I do in the privacy of my own car? But it struck me as, we were at an intersection where the number of cases was rising, the number of deaths was rising, the hospitalization rate is rising. What the governor calls I can't remember what he calls it. It's the infection rate is rising, that we're not doing these simple things that would allow us to, slow those increases and keep the economy going, which is what everybody seems to be wanting us to do. I'd like to be safe and back at work.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, that, it's not unusual for people want things in the political and policy realm that are in tension, sometimes even mutually exclusive. And I think, we're in a long discussion about trying to find, I was going to call it the sweet spot, but it's not really that. But, the ideal way of reconciling these competing goals, which are clearly in tension as we watch the virus spread. I mean, I'm wondering how, I want to get to the politics of this a little later, but, it seems pretty clear to me that the symbolism that masking, quote unquote, as we now call it, has taken on is powerfully shaped by the signals that we're seeing from the national policy environment, and particularly the president, right?
Yeah, it's sort of the, if you put a mask on your face, there's something to see here. And there's why do you have a mask on your face? Well, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and this is the way to stop the disease. But if you're kind of denying the disease or denying the spread of the disease or even arguing that the disease is getting better, then a mask is an affront to that argument. And, the president seems to have taken that to an extreme, and people follow their leaders. In the beginning of this pandemic, back in March, and I believe throughout April and into May, none of the state's leaders were wearing masks. You didn't see Greg Abbott or Dan Patrick or either of the senators from Texas wearing masks. Now you see them in masks. The line has turned. The instructions from the medical experts are pretty clear on this. Look, this helps. And if you want to get out and about like we all do, and like, the people who want to boost the economy do, the people who just want to get out of their houses do, the way to do that is to, wash your hands, wear a mask, and keep your distance.
So, yeah, I think there's a lot of political signaling going on at all levels shapes people's responses, I think. And so we got another bundle of signals yesterday. So your column came out yesterday morning, and then in the afternoon yesterday, the governor did a press briefing, which he's been doing semi-regularly during the pandemic. How did you read that press conference in the context of what we've been talking about?
I thought he changed key. I thought he went from major key to minor key. This became an unacceptable rise in the number of cases. This is from a governor who said everything is under control. Cases are rising. They're rising moderately. Everything's okay here. Everything's okay here. And that was how we ended last week. And we came into this week with the governor saying this is an unacceptable increase in the number of cases. And I'm not going to do anything about it immediately, but we are watching this very carefully. And if it continues, we might have to close some of the things we've reopened and reconsider some of the things that we're doing right now. And he, reiterated his message on, masking and distancing and washing.
I want to pick up on something you said there. I think it was the contrast with the last event, which was late last week, as I recall, that the governor did, was really striking, because the message of the last event was to suggest that, they had things under control in a sense, as you say, and what most of that press conference was about was the fact that hospital capacity there was still plenty of hospital capacity in the state. And in fact, he had Dr. Zerwas, former legislative member now with UT Health System, who's been one of the point people on this in the governor's task force. A bunch of that press event was Dr. Zerwas showing a series of slides showing how much capacity there was in the major hospitals in the areas. And I think in a way there was something embedded in that really worked against the message that really came out more fully this week, which was, we're telling you not to worry because there's a lot of room in the hospitals. Well, if we shouldn't worry, why are we paying so much attention to hospital capacity, beyond the fact that hospital capacity early on was one of the metrics of containment? So, the
messaging also has some ambiguity in it, because if you say, don't worry, we have room in the hospital, they're saying, you're going to get sick, but we have a bed for you.
Yeah, right. That's
another way to read that message, and that's not exactly comforting.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was getting at, is that by the time Monday rolled around, we had these sharp increases, and I think that embedded contradiction or tension really came out. So, I want to talk a little bit about where they go from here, because it seems to me that the approach in Texas has been to create a framework for responding to the pandemic and either its spread or its containment, that in the beginning was billed as, this will be a controlled way of opening up. And if the opening, doesn't go well, we will then reverse ourselves along this spectrum of various prohibitions and slow easing of restrictions. Right. But your characterization of how the governor's press conference went yesterday and what his message was, was interesting in the sense in that, he sort of vaguely signaled that if, in a sense, people didn't do better and start, wearing masks and washing their hands, that at some vaguely defined point, he was talking about it's at one level a benchmark for a month from now, that we will have to reverse ourselves. But they've shown zero willingness to do that, right?
Yeah, don't you make me pull this car over, right? What they're trying to do here, and I don't think they would articulate it this way, but I will. They're trying to figure out an acceptable level of infection from the coronavirus. And by that, I mean, they can't make that level zero. They know some people are going to have this disease until we have a cure for it. And there's a level beyond which we can't handle the cases. The hospitals can't handle them. You get too much of the population sick, everything goes haywire. So you try to keep this at an acceptable level, and you control that by controlling the activities that help the coronavirus spread. And we were going okay, really, until kind of the events leading up to immediately before and then through Memorial Day, when the governor took his foot off the brakes. He, opened some of the restaurants and bars and hair salons and all of the other things that had been closed from the beginning, and opened them faster than he had said he would, and did it right before a 3-day weekend where you sort of released a population of people who'd been, we've all been cooped up. Everybody wants to get outside. The weather's great. We've got a 3-day weekend. The governor's opening the stores. This is going to be fantastic. Everybody goes out. And immediately, if you were watching the other meter, in the form of the medical community or the public health community, they were saying, oh, this is going to raise cases. And I began to hear it at that point, as I think everybody did who was listening. Those guys were saying between Memorial Day and the 4th of July, we're really going to see whether this Memorial Day thing had an effect. And then George Floyd was killed, and we started 9 or 10 days of pretty constant outside demonstrations. And there was another set of, just from the public health standpoint, there was another set of crowds. And, we're still right at the point where we're going to find out exactly what that did. But all of these things accelerated the number of cases. And we've gone clearly above the governor's secret number of acceptable level of infection. And if we keep that up, he says we're going to have to hit the brakes in some way. Ironically, they're about to announce all the details of opening schools, which is another accelerant. And if you're talking about the communication of this disease from one person to another.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about that. The school, the subject of opening schools, closing and then opening schools has been, a very sensitive one all along, obviously because of the importance of education. I think there's a line in your column Monday that talks about the, just the importance of trying to make up for lost time and just the substance of making sure that, kids in the public school system get taught, for, lack of a better term.
Well, yeah, and it's multifaceted. You've got the education problems. If you stop educating kids, at least at that age, and it's really important to keep the momentum going. We've got these kids learning, they're halfway through the alphabet, this set over here, and this one's, switching to this kind of reader, and that one's switching to this kind of math. And you want to keep that momentum going. And if you stop, teachers have always said, summer costs them some time. So they leave kids in May, and then September, or when they come back to school, they've got some remediation to do for the lost months of the summer. We doubled the size of the summer in those terms. There have not been very many success stories really about virtual learning replacing actual in-person learning, and they want to get the kids back in school. So education's one thing. You're going to put 5.5 million Texans back into circulation, back into social circulation, and you've got to figure out how to get kids back in schools, and maintain hand washing and masks and social distancing and all of that stuff. And they're also going from, maybe all the kids, maybe it turns out that little kids are safe together in school and all of that's great, but they come back home and then they go back to school and then they come back home and they go back to school. And that communication between sort of the inside world that they're in and the outside world is another opportunity for coronavirus. So in effect, by opening schools, you're doing the same kind of thing you did by opening shopping malls and bars and all the other.
Well, and then the other piece of that is economic, in that, kids that are not going to school, wind up being de facto having to be homeschooled by their parents. The parents have to pay attention to that. The parents then, whether they're working at home or not, have to figure out how to deal with the fact that their kids are not in school during the day. This has been, I think, a big issue all over the place. I know it's an issue here at UT with, younger faculty members that have young kids, as UT talks about what they're going to do in the fall and tries to execute some kind of series of contingency plans and preparation for that. The question of what faculty members and staff members with young school-age kids are going to do is a huge one in trying to figure out what works on that. So, I want to
public
talk
education. It is that it's daycare for 5.5 million kids.
Yeah, exactly, and and that sets aside even the question of daycare itself for preschool age kids, which is also looming very large out there as both a public health and an economic factor. We've talked about, what the governor is going to do, what the state government is not going to do, and just, what the plans are and who's going to execute has in itself been a significant policy problem. So, we're getting news now that, in the last, I think, week or so, it's hard for me to know exactly when this started, and the governor had said this, there's been a use of some of the regulatory agencies to try to tamp down some of the, what should we say, social excesses. So, for example, TABC, the alcohol enforcement arm of the state government, licensing and enforcement arm of the state government, has been doing bar checks, not to check the things they usually check, like underage drinking and pouring licensed liquor, but to see if bars and bar restaurants are complying with the guidelines that have been declared. How many tools does the state have to do that, do you think?
I think they have a lot of tools. The question is whether they want to use them. I mean, you very quickly get into the politics of it. As a practical matter, they can close bars all day. They can close, all businesses. We did that. We saw that in March. There's a question about how long they can do it, but in terms of just the tools that are available to them, that's one of the tools that's available. But then you very quickly get to, at what point do you engender a bunch of civil disobedience? Whether it's, a hairstylist named Shelley Luther opening her shop in defiance of the governor's order to stop haircuts for a while. At what point does the thing come apart? And Greg Abbott's in the position of balancing, how much discipline you can mete out, against what people will take. It seems to vary really with, people's perception about coronavirus and perception about the economy and perception about civil liberties. And, where their attention is at any given moment kind of determines what it is they're going to do. A great example is the people who went out in really large numbers to protest police brutality and racial injustice, in spite of the fact that there was a pandemic. At that point, they, in their order of importance of things, clearly had the importance of demonstrating ranked above the danger of the pandemic in their minds when they made that decision when they went out. And they did it one by one, but a large number of people did that. A large number of people decided that these restrictions on everything from bars to haircuts to, whatever, really were more of an affront than the pandemic was a danger, that they were really, really for opening the economy and for having their freedom and, damn the torpedoes, to heck with the disease. As the numbers have risen with the disease, you see that shifting back a little bit. Primarily, the place where you see it is in Greg Abbott's eyes right now. The change from last week to this week was a significant one, and I think was driven by the increase in the strength of the coronavirus in Texas.
Yeah, somebody in the political world that I was talking to about the press conference yesterday commented that, in political terms, she thought that all the principals at the press conference, had a bit of fear in their eyes, and in their affect as you watch them move through that press conference. You raised the politics of this, and I want to talk about that for a few minutes. I think that, and you and I have talked about this, and when we looked at the polling that we did in the April UT Texas Tribune poll, the challenge to the political leadership, I thought, was presented very clearly in those poll results. Because on one hand, if you looked at, for example, the item in which we asked whether people thought that anybody who had been exposed to the virus, I think, should be quarantined for 14 days. The civil libertarian kind of impulses that the governor is wary of were really fairly muted in that response. I think more than 80% supported that, and a majority of Republicans, as I recall.
There was a majority of every single group,
subgroup,
however you break them. Right.
It seemed to me all along that gave the state leadership something to work with. Now, as we started to parse that out, and we said, we asked people what they thought were reasonable limitations and how long the stay at that time, what was the stay-at-home order, would last. You began to see a bit more, in some ways, in some places, substantially more division among Republicans and conservatives. But the baseline of acceptance of that seemed to, of the seriousness of the virus seemed to be there. And I think the big question as we're moving forward is, to what degree is that eroded, and to what degree can that be restored by communication and by the situation on the ground. And I don't know how to handicap that really, other than by getting more data, which we hope to do soon.
Yeah, I think they've just got to kind of keep an eye on all of the, you're basically controlling the responses to danger. And if the coronavirus is rising, then you increase the responses to that. You tell people to wear masks. You tell people that you might have to slow things back down. If the disease, when the disease appears to be in hand or controlled, really as it did at the beginning of May, it looked like, we had sort of figured out how to plateau this thing. We had flattened the curve, to use the language of that moment. And, it seemed like everything was going okay, and that maybe we could reopen some things and get people out and try to take care of the economy, which is also an existential danger. People can't work and can't pay for their place to, food, shelter, clothing, and all of that. It's, as dangerous in some ways as the disease is. So I think these guys, the problem is that they've got this very quickly moving situation with the pandemic, a very quickly moving situation with the economy, and the tools that they've got are a little bit blunt. So you changed something and then you wait 2 weeks to see how it worked. or something goes bad and you have to make a change and you don't get to see a change in direction for 2 weeks. It's really hard to respond to this. And it's particularly hard if you haven't got a steady stream of communication going. And I think this is a place where a lot of the leadership has failed. You don't have a steady line of communication that says, look, we are in a dangerous circumstance. This is going to be very hard. We all have to throw in together and we all have to keep our eye on the ball. And instead, we've let that waver around. For a while, we were afraid of the pandemic, and then we weren't afraid of it at all. We were worried about the economy. And then all of a sudden, we were worried about civil liberties. And then the pandemic came back. It's hard to keep people's eye on the ball, and it's particularly hard to get the public to follow a leader who hasn't been clear and concise and consistent.
I want to end on that point of leadership in a second, but I also want to, I think the other thing it's important to underline here is that as we're talking about tools and the threat of, how you balance economic hardship and, the inability to make a living or, put food on the table, is that we've in Texas, but also because of the leadership at the national level, we've also constrained our choices beforehand in that regard. And that, Greg Abbott is unlikely to announce, a major economic support program for those that are unemployed or that are experiencing economic hardship, in part because we don't have the policy tools to do that, in part because the policy environment is so limited. And in fact, some of those economic measures we've already begun to reverse, the measures that were taken at the state level in the early period of the pandemic. And so, I think the policy environment as we find it has also deprived the state of some tools. There have been stimulus measures passed at the federal level, but that's also stalled out in Washington, which I think to some degree is not just about the communication piece you're talking about, but about, the policy environment that is defined by politics.
One of the answers to economic problems in Texas has always been get business revved up and let's power out of this thing, and the answer immediately when the state, shut down was, unemployment insurance gets stepped up. You have all of this social network that answers that in the short term, but their medium and long-term answer was, we can't keep doing this. To your point, what we need to do is open the economy, make sure everybody's working. And if they're working, then they have the income to take care of these things that if they're not working, we have to pay for with unemployment insurance. So I think the economic, the return to a fully open economy was their answer in some way to the social problem caused by pandemic and quarantine. But as I said, it's an imperfect tool. You put everybody back out into the workplace or back out into the economy or back into the shopping malls, restaurants, and all of those things, and you've given another fresh foothold to the pandemic. And, this is where consistent messaging would have helped them. If they had stayed the course, two things here. Early on, Greg Abbott came out and said, look, the state is going to do these things to this point. If you feel like in your local area you need more or you need to do something different, go ahead and do that. And that gave mayors and county judges and superintendents, a bunch of leeway to do things locally. And then he came in a few weeks later and said, we're going to have one set of rules for the whole state and nobody can go beyond those rules, which put him at odds with, in particular, some of the big cities and big counties in the state, where they had spot problems that they wanted to do, where they wanted to take other actions that the state government was not taking. And now he's sort of going back into his early stance of, the state's going to do this set of regs, and if you need to do something local, here are some ways where you might do that. The example here was, you can't fine or penalize people for not wearing masks, but you can fine or penalize businesses that don't require people to wear masks, which is another way to get at the same thing and to try to skirt the political objections from civil libertarians. I just think that they're having a hard time controlling this because they've been inconsistent about talking about the real threat of this and what they were doing about it and why.
Do my read of this, that is, in the end, the state leadership, and, you have to say the governor and his team have been worried about the response from within their own party and from within certain corners of their own party. I was willing, frankly, to see that as somewhat reasonable in some of the muddied and deliberate action leading up to the shutdown of the state. It seems to me it's becoming a real constraint on their ability to respond effectively.
I think it was a good idea in the short term. I think you were right in the short term, and I think that's what they were thinking. I think they're all well intentioned. They didn't want it to go haywire, but the models on this, this is going to seem over dramatic, but the models on this are people like Winston Churchill, who Britain's getting bombed, Germany is right there, America hasn't got into this thing, and he goes on the radio and he tells everybody, look, we're in for it, and this is going to be really, really tough. This is going to be really, really hard. We might fail. In fact, the odds are against us, but we're going to lean into it and fight this thing. And then, they kept that message and that idea, and, eventually things came around. That worked. But that's also a model of communication through a thing like this. You have to acknowledge the problem. Don't talk it down. Don't say it's going to be over in a minute. Don't say it's already gone, which is a problem mainly from the White House. And then you have to bear down and stick to your guns, even when it's uncomfortable. When, people are hollering to get haircuts, you have to say, just let your hair grow. This is more important.
I think that's a good place to close it today. Ross, thanks a lot. You haven't had a haircut, have you?
Appreciate it. I actually bought a pair of clippers and started cutting it myself. I figured I was old enough that I'd had 400 or 500 haircuts in my life, and I should have learned something. And besides, I can't see the back.
So who cares, right? A role model for us all. Well, thanks a lot for the conversation and trenchant analysis, Ross. Stay safe. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks to our crew in Liberal Arts ITS. And we will talk again next week. Take care, all. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.